we're talking about. Now, our next method of developmental research is called cross-sectional designs. This is like my dissertation, where I just took a snapshot of a group of subjects at one point in time. So the cross-sectional is, again, we can still track individuals over a year or so, but we do snapshots, just one point in time. Probably use a survey. We can do interviews with that group of subjects, but it's just a snapshot of what they're doing at that point in time, their attitudes, their behaviors, their development, and their growth at one point in time. Again, we may do, let's say we do it at the beginning of the school year, middle of the school year, and at the end of the school year. And see if there's been a change there. The strengths with this type of design is that it's less time consuming, especially if you just do surveys. It's just a snapshot at that time. Surveys, excuse me, are just really quick to do, easy analysis. Now, I'm thinking about that. If you look at the thesis example that I provided in the course documents, that's kind of a cross-sectional design, because what the researcher looked at is she set up an experimental design, a little bit more than descriptive design, but she wanted to compare how the bench players and the starting players, their attitudes towards, where there are differences in their attitudes, basically. But she looked at, the researcher looked at, I believe she used a survey instrument and interviews at the midpoint of the semester and at the end of the semester, end of the season, just to kind of compare them. So that's kind of a cross-sectional design to give you an idea. So there's two different cross-sectional designs for examples in the course documents that you can look at. So if you're interested in that. And again, the strength is less time-consuming. One of the weaknesses that the textbook talks about is called cohort problem. And the question is, are all the subjects really from the same population? Are they really a true representation of the population? Because a lot of times we don't do random selection with this type of research. We just choose who's there. And the textbook talks about that on page 288. They give a really good example here. This is so the cohort problem, are all the age groups really from the same population group of cohorts? Ask another way, are the environmental circumstances that affect jumping performance for 6-year-olds the same today as when 10-year-olds were 6, or have physical education programs improved over this 4-year span so that 6-year-olds receive more instruction and practice in jumping than the 10-year-olds when they were 6? And so we kind of have to look beyond just what's going on at that point in time. Did things change in the past or in the future, or was the other variables the result of that change and that development of those students? So that's just some things you have to think through after you get the data and look at it. And there's really a combination of the two. We can combine the longitudinal, we can look at groups of people over a long period of time and do snapshots like I talked about, the cross-sectional design. So that's quite common, whereas we have a combination of a longitudinal and cross-sectional design for developmental research. And just so you know, all these designs here, the longitudinal, cross-sectional, or the combination of the two, we can actually use an experimental element in them if we want to. Like I said, the thesis example has an element to that. And so you can manipulate the independent variable to see the effect that independent variable has on the dependent variable to determine cause and effect. Other thing you can do is you can set up research questions to compare the groups. That's survey research. In my dissertation, that's what I did, is I compared the novice athletic training student, that's the athletic training student that's just beginning their program, and compare them to the experienced athletic training student. That's the student in their second or third year of their program, and to see if there's a difference in their attitudes and their beliefs, their socialization into the program. That was a cross-sectional design, but it was still developmental research in a lot of ways. So we can do a little bit more with developmental research than just descriptive. We had the following methodological problems with their methods. We have 4 of those. The first one is called unrepresentative scores. We've talked about this in the previously. It's called outliers. These are individuals that really don't represent the population. They're on, when we talked about the bell-shaped curve, they're either on the far left or far right of the curve, and they really just don't represent our true population, and they can really mess up our scores. And children as subjects may lead to bad data because kids' lack of attention, distractions, or lack of motivation. We all know that if we've been around kids. And on page 298 of the textbook, they have 3 ways that we can handle that with, especially with the kids. And the first one is to plan the testing situation within a reasonable time limit that accounts for attention span. That's a really good suggestion. Is don't make a test too long for kids, because they'll just lose attention spans and you won't get the best out of them. The second thing to do is set up the testing situation where distractions cannot happen. So don't let the kids be distracted if you're working with younger kids. Make it in a way that they're not distracted. Be aware of what unrepresentative score is and retest when one happens. So if you know like kids are distracted, you may just need to retest them. So those are 3 good ways to resolve the unrepresentative scores for children, and so you make sure you get good data. Now the next one is unclear semantics. Now semantics, we're talking about words. For example, some of you probably have had problems with the words and description of assignments that maybe I've given you, and it's unclear, it's vague. You're not sure what I'm talking about. And so if you're doing some kind of test, or you got a survey, you got interviews, you have to make sure that your questions on the survey, on the test, descriptions, anything that you have needs to be perfectly clear. Any definitions of terms must be defined so anybody will understand them. Especially for kids, you got to make sure that you describe them in such a way that the children will understand them. Keep in mind the age of the subjects that you may be working with. And again, explain them so your subjects will understand them. And use the principle of keep it simple, silly, the KISS principle. Make sure that everybody can understand the language that you're trying to use. And do not assume that people understand everything. That's true when you're writing papers too. Our next methodological problem is called lack of reliability. We have talked about reliability quite a few times. Again, reliability is just like if somebody is reliable, they're dependable. That means that they'll do what they say they're going to do. Well, reliability is, in this situation, is will the subjects, especially we're talking about children here, will they be able to repeat their performance? And we've talked about reasons why children may not be able to repeat their performance, lack of attention, those type of things. So in order to get good reliable scores, especially with children, is make the activity fun and enjoyable. Let them make it enjoyable so they'll want to do it and they'll give their best over the time. And our last methodological problem is a statistical problem. How do we compare these groups? They've changed over time. We're talking years, or we could be talking about years. The textbook talks about we typically use an ANOVA The problem with the ANOVA test, one of the assumptions we make with a ANOVA test is that the groups are equal, the variance is equal. Well, that's not necessarily true with developmental research. That's the whole reason why we're doing this type of research. So it'd probably be best, again, that we just compare everything with descriptive statistics, the means and those type of things. So that's just an issue if you're reading journal articles, and when they do longitudinal studies, you just have to think about